Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Geospatial Forum. I'm Ross Mintemeyer, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Caren Cooper as our speaker today. She's a faculty fellow in the Center for Geospatial Analytics from the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. I'm sure all of you mostly already know that. Her research focuses on, over the years, avian ecology, human dimensions of natural resources. And in case you are not aware, Caren is an expert. I mean this sincerely. She is an internationally recognized expert and pioneer of citizen science. She literally wrote the book that is as widely known and referred to for this very exciting emerging field and really paradigm shift. It's very cool. So anyways, Caren, thanks.
All right, thank you. Is this working? Yeah. No, not working. It is. Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here. And thanks so much for showing up on a Friday. Thank the rain in the forecast that brought you all here. Anyway, yeah, I'm pleased to present today. And yeah, I wanted to thank John for the mistake of inviting me. I just hastily, he was like, you want to give this seminar? I was like, yeah, sure. I was like, sure, I'll talk at the, Geospatial Forum. Okay, I am a faculty fellow. I have used ArcGIS and GRASS. I just haven't done it recently, like this century, but I have. Anyway, but so I don't know if you knew when you invited me, what you were really saying was, you want to come give a talk about citizen science? I'm like, yeah, that's how I always interpret it. And so, yeah, anyway, so even though I don't do much geospatial work anymore, the participatory sciences and citizen science, so much of it is about geospatial data. Okay, let me get started. So yeah, I wanted to just like quell any expectations right now. Like I said, my research questions are not geospatial, but my research is aimed at improving geospatial data that's from the participatory sciences. Okay, so just to give you a little outline of what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to start just with a little background about me and my lab, just so you know who's up here talking, a little bit about my background with geospatial stuff and my research group. And then I'm going to talk about the participatory sciences and the geospatial data that comes from citizen science. I'm going to tell you how awesome and great it is. That's what I do all the time. Like, it's the best thing. There's so much power. It's so powerful. All these things about how wonderful it is. Then I'm going to tell you why that's a lie, and why that's not fully the truth, and that actually the participatory sciences and the data it produces actually has a diversity problem, like in terms of racial diversity, economic diversity, cultural diversity, all those kind of things. And then I'm going to tell you why that's kind of not really accurate either, and talk a little bit about why participatory science has a structural problem. And then I'll mention a little bit about what we're going to do, what we're trying to do about it with what we call the ideal participatory science initiative. So just to start with me and my lab. Back in the day. I know I look different, right? Because I had bangs. So does anyone know where I went to undergraduate? This is me with a bear, because I was, for 3 years, an intern studying bears in Pisgah National Forest, when the Pisgah Bear Sanctuary was newly established. And it was geospatial, because we were collaring and monitoring the bears to see if the population was sufficient to have enough juvenile males dispersing off to satisfy the hunters. But I was an undergraduate here. I was here at NC State And I did that work up, the bear sanctuary is up near Asheville. And it was very formative because I was the intern, like for several seasons, summers, winters, whatever. And I worked side by side with Earthwatch volunteers, right? So our field crew were people who were volunteering, who were paying to have their vacation be trapping bears, you know, hiking, checking the traps, radio tracking them. And anyway, it's just funny because it all comes full circle because here I am back at NC State. I came back a few years ago, and I'm also on the board of directors now of Earthwatch. Anyway, we had a lot of, we were the cheapest project, actually. So, but anyway, we had a lot of really fun volunteers. But anyway, I guess what I'm really saying is it definitely primed me for later, like the term citizen science wasn't even coined then, but for later when I did enter the world of citizen science, I think I was a little more predisposed to it than some of my colleagues who were scoffing at it because I had already been working side by side in the field with people who had other professions who were just doing it for fun. Anyway, I did various wildlife work, blah, 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 but eventually did my PhD work at Virginia Tech, but my field work was in Australia. And I studied brown tree creepers, this little tiny little brown bird. It's probably the dullest bird in Australia to look at. There's like all these parrots and pretty things. But anyway, and it was a landscape scale study where I struggled to get as much data as I could. I mean, it was very productive, and I did digitize my study area from aerial photos, and I did an individually based spatially explicit simulation model of dispersal events. I did a field experiment, moving birds around related to dispersal, whatever. Anyway, it was very productive and a bit really did shine some new light on studies of habitat fragmentation from a perspective from Australia. But anyway, but then I went to Cornell and spent most of my career, I guess, then at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and working at continental scales with citizen science data, in particular with data on bluebirds. Anyway, this is old. I mean, now the data set's even bigger. But anyway, yeah, it's like data sets of tens of thousands of nesting attempts. Anyway, and my lab here, includes a lot of different interests. I've had some, my initial students were master's students who ran and developed citizen science projects on soundscapes and on contaminants in eggs and on water quality. And then I have some students who are ornithologists, and then some who are, Deja in the Center for Geospatial Analytics, and others that are social sciences. Anyway, so there's a lot of different interests, the majority of which, but not all, relate to the participatory sciences. All of it relates to public science in some way. All right, so I'll just, I'm going to tell you a little bit about citizen science. Probably, I mean, raise your hand if you think you're very familiar with citizen science. You are very familiar. Well, I know you are, Deja. Yeah, okay. So actually not as many people, or maybe people are just modest. I don't know. Raise your hand if you're not familiar with it at all. I'm curious. Okay, so everyone's a little bit familiar with it. And eBird's kind of an iconic. Raise your hand if you eBird. Oh, wow, okay. Well, that's more hands than what people were saying they were familiar with it. Then you're very familiar with it. Anyway, so yeah, this animated map is, it's more, it can be more up to date than the field guides. It's, based on thousands of bird watchers, I guess maybe even tens of thousands of bird watchers, hundreds of thousands of bird observations. It's been used in hundreds of different publications about a range of topics related to climate change, invasive species, management, all kinds of things, used by a lot of different stakeholders, used by researchers, used by managers on the ground, used by birders to figure out where they want to go birding. A couple of things I like to point out just to dispel some myths about citizen science. One, a colleague, Andrea, says, she always likes to say, it's free like puppies. So like, if someone can give you a puppy for nothing, but then like you got to pay to feed it and take it to the vet. And like, there's a lot of costs actually in maintaining and bringing up that puppy. Anyway, it's the same with citizen science. Sure, it's volunteers, but that by no means means that it's free. There's like a lot in managing volunteers and other, whatever kind of participants. And there's a lot in managing big data, which you all probably know, like all that's required with managing big data. But the other thing I like to dispel about is that it's new and that it requires like modern geospatial tools, which it actually doesn't. And like this map of bird movements, this is, bird migration, is really the same as this map, which is of whale migrations that was created in like 1835 or so. And yeah, it's not animated and pretty, but it's the same data. It's presence, absence. It's occurrence data with effort data. Like how many, if we were to zoom in, it's like these graphs for every month, how many ship hours were present, ship hour basically were present. And then how many right whales and sperm whales were seen. Anyway, Matthew Mowry was the one who like crowdsourced and assembled all this information from ship logbooks. What he's most known for, though, is assembling that same kind of information and creating specialized logbooks for ships to use to crowdsource information on currents and wind. And these kind of maps that he would continually improve, made sailing safer and faster for everyone. It's one of the quotes I like from one of the people that used it, which said, "Until I took up your work, I had been traversing the ocean blindfolded." Because it speaks to the power of people. Everyone had their own experiences, but of bringing all that information together and making it readily available for all the ships to use. So anyway, he's called the Pathfinder of the Seas. He's considered the father of oceanography, and he's a forebearer of GeoInt. I don't know if you know that phrase. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's geospatial. It's geospatial intelligence. So like his project still continues to this day. It's just morphed. It went online in like, I don't remember, like some in the 2000s. But it's run by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So they love the guy. They have, most of their buildings are named after him. They have remembrances. They have a book. They celebrate his birthday. Like he's everything to the NGA. Anyway, they consider him the forebearer of geospatial intelligence, their tradecraft, as they call it. Anyway, yeah, nowadays, if they don't really do wind and currents, they mostly report on pirates. Anyway, which is just to say there's also some other Victorian era, like very prominent scientists who used what would today be called citizen science. And so I just want to highlight one other one of them, which is William Ewell. And he was studying the tides and making it so it wasn't just about like the moon or, effect on tides, but like on the ground studies. And he arranged for there to be 750 stations on both sides of the Atlantic that at the same exact time would measure the tide marks every 15 minutes for 2 weeks straight. Because he wanted to draw these co-tidal lines. Like, does it go back and forth? Like, what's it all about? And he won a big medal for that and whatever. But like my main point is that like he's super well known. He's considered one of the four in this, like this book is really good. It's the Philosopher's Breakfast Club. He and 3 other men at Oxford like were really formative in creating what we know today as science. And I always pictured him like the Judd Nelson one. Anyways, he's only one person who was a Breakfast Club. Anyway, but anyway, most of the things that you probably don't like about science is from him. Like he was the king of jargon. People would literally go to him and be like, I heard for this electrical part, call it an ion. Like he coined everything. He coined the term scientist. Before that, they were men of science. He did it sarcastically at first, because there was this woman and he called her a scientist. Because she couldn't be a man of science. And then he was like, oh, I like that term. And then he said we should all be whatever. That's the generalist, is the science. Anyway, point being, he also was the one who campaigned for governments to start funding science. because before that you had to be rich or have a benefactor who was rich. He said, nope, he convinced the government to start funding it. And it was because why? Because it was imperialist. Because why were they studying tides? Because it was the British Royal Navy wanted to be able to arrive anywhere and know what the tides would be. So anyway, my point is that there's this, the origins of what, there's many ways of knowing, but the origins of what we are kind of considering science and citizen science come from these kind of origins. And I guess one last thing about him is that he coined scientist, he didn't coin citizen science instead, but he called the participants was subordinate laborers. It's hilarious. So anyway, and then he also did have computers because he ended up collecting, it was like 800,000 data points where there were what we consider computers. He called them computers. They were just men that knew calculus. Kind of like today, we have people who are thinkers, but in the future, they'll just be chatbots. Anyway, other old projects, like actually one of the oldest in the US is the National Weather Observer Program, or the Cooperative Observer Network that NOAA runs. Anyway, this is a participant in that program, Richard Hendrickson. He started monitoring when he was 18. He's 101 in that picture. He monitored until he died at 103. Anyway, so there's a lot of long-term volunteering, a lot of long-term networks. And just to say, keep saying that. Anyway, almost any topic, there's thousands of citizen science projects now, like, on phenology, on, and there's ones where you can submit it like any kind of animal, like to iNaturalist, ones that are so many volunteer water quality monitoring networks, any topic, cicadas, mosquitoes, nurdles, right? A little plastic on the beach, like, right? Who even has heard of nurdles? But there's a nurdle citizen science project. So almost anything that you might be interested in, I guarantee you there's probably a project. And these are just ones that are geospatial. You go away from geospatial stuff, there's a whole other range of projects. Anyway, what I really like about citizen science is there's so many discoveries that we've made from it. It's a lot of the ground-based weather data. Like, so we know the climate is changing, partly because of citizen science data. That monarch butterflies migrate 4,000 miles. That was a citizen science discovery. That birds breed earlier because of climate change. So much of our knowledge about birds and climate change come from citizen science. Those data span more than what any scientist could do alone. About invasive ladybirds in the UK, the genetic population structure of turtles, shifts in butterfly species ranges, even like evolutionary adaptations in dragonflies, that there's 50 types of bacteria in your belly button, right? It's one of Rob Dunn's projects. So tons of different discoveries that wouldn't be possible otherwise, possible from citizen science. So I'm this big booster of it all the time. Yes, I work with SciStarter. It's a hub for citizen science. I do a lot trying to like advance the field. I have a part of this it's undergraduate student experiences in citizen science. We have a faculty fellows program and a certificate people can earn on SciStarter for helping faculty use citizen science in their classroom. And then I co-led the co-creation of this data ethics toolkit for the participatory sciences. And again, we have like a tutorial and a badge on LinkedIn, whatever. Anyway, happy to talk more about any of those efforts. And here we have a citizen science campus, with a club. The libraries loan out tools. We've mimicked this with grants support that we have at North Carolina A&T and partly also at Shaw. And I'm very excited about all these initiatives. And it's because I love citizen science so much is why, I like to criticize it too. So which is why I'm going to say, get it on the right side. As I mentioned earlier, so yes, it's great, but it's not fully great, right? It has a major problem in who is engaging with citizen science. And so Bradley Alf in my lab, he published this study in Bioscience. It was a survey that we did of participants in Audubon's Christmas bird count. I won't even go into the whole Audubon. I don't know if people follow that Audubon controversy name, but anyway, what he found was, the Christmas bird count started in 1900. It's been going on, for over a century. Anyway, over 3,000 respondents, 96% white, also highly educated, affluent, also a lot, I think like half in STEM careers. So really, it's like scientists are doing citizen science as a hobby. It's really not reaching as far or engaging as much as maybe we were hoping. There's a lot of people that talk about it's democratizing science. Like, well, okay, well, we'll debate that a little further. This is just what it means for geospatial data. This is a paper by Frank Lessort at Cornell at the Lab of Ornithology, talking about the distribution of eBird data and the representativeness or the completeness of it. And basically what you can see here is that like even at a global scale, we see these disparities in that there's sure, people do eBird everywhere, but mostly because there's bird tourists everywhere. But really most of the checklist, most of the participation is in the global north. Even though what the lower graph is showing is that even though bird species richness is more equatorial, right? And it'd be, so it's not like where people are watching birds in a global sense in this case is matching the distribution of birds. But we see these same patterns at any scale that we look at. And so like, for example, I'm going to talk just briefly about Deja's, one of her dissertation chapters, which is looking at eBird data and iNaturalist data. And actually comparing across urban and rural, just because the patterns are slightly different. But what she's finding, looking at the contributions of data related to poverty level and related to BIPOC, meaning pretty much non-white areas, and sort of the probability of having an observation. The green lines are iNaturalist and the blue lines are eBird. And you see that there's a really strong relationship with poverty level. This is, in urban areas, and then also, especially for eBird, that as there's in the more areas that are more people of color, there's lower probability of having eBird observations. And then it's similar in the rural areas, we see that effect with poverty, but not so much with race. Anyway, the main takeaways here is that, so poverty level seems to matter in urban and rural areas, and race matters, especially with eBird in urban areas. And so, so I'm kind of drawing this line between like, oh, there's this underrepresentation of people of color in the participatory sciences, and to this saying that there's these racial-based spatial gaps and clustering based on race in these geospatial data sets, right? All the citizen science data sets, like in a geospatial sense, they're all very clustered where people live. But in this case, I'm saying they're race-based clustering. And so I just want to fill in the gaps here as to what's needed for that to happen. And one reason that occurs is that in most of these projects, there's a lot of autonomy in where the geospatial observation happens, right? So in most of these projects, very unstructured data, it's just haphazard. It's like, oh, I see this thing, I'm going to report it. I'm going to take on my app and share that observation. It's not usually protocol driven. But the other thing that's needed for these patterns to happen is that there's spatial segregation by race, which we do see in the US. But anyway, so just briefly related to autonomy, most observations, people do tend to observe near their home or at home. Anyway, this is just from Deja's master's work, where she compared just regular eBird data, which can be like, even if it's semi-structured in many ways, with atlas data, meaning where people are told where to go, which has much lower participation because people don't like to be told where to go. But she compared these data in cities in or in metropolitan areas in 3 different states. And basically with the data sets, they could typically detect that there was a species area relationship, which you'd expect, like in ecology, that the bigger the area, the higher the species richness. But actually only the atlas style could detect the luxury effect. The luxury effect is this, it's documented pretty regularly that more affluent areas have higher species richness of biodiversity than poorer areas. And, but you can't detect it with regular eBird data, just because there's not enough, it's not distributed enough to be able to detect. With regard to spatial segregation, people have probably you've probably heard people talk or maybe work with, ideas around redlining. And what I want to point out here is that, redlining was really just like kind of codifying what was already happening, right? Because I just want to dispel that, because there's still so many practices that are going on that continue to perpetuate racial segregation in where we live. So there's a lot of, and plus there's the legacy of it. So I guess what I'm saying is it started before and redlining and continues after redlining. And just as an example of how the legacy of things and how things continue to be perpetuated, these are just showing the distribution of different race and ethnicities in the United States, right? And so you can see this lower one, the green one, is African-American populations in the United States. You can see the legacy of being descended from slaves, right? So it's half the Black population in the US is in the Southeast. And you can see the orange is Hispanic populations, and you can see Cuba and Mexico and Central America migrations, like that legacy and current, whatever, is very much affects spatial distributions, and top is tribal, and legacy is with reservations, and then the blue is white. Anyway, which is just to say, there's these patterns of segregation at this continental scale, and a lot of practices that continue to maintain segregation. But you see it at the state level, see it at city levels, at all spatial scales. There's still some racial segregation. Anyway, so with those things in place, that's why it matters who's participating and why it affects data quality. And this is a study that Deja and I did with Dylan Mahmoudi. And it was about called COCOROS, the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. It's a precipitation monitoring project, put out rain gauges. It's useful for, it's a big part of forecasting, especially for flooding events. Anyway, this is just showing, well, mostly it's showing, see, it was geospatial. It was this century too, it was very recent. But anyway, it's Baltimore there on whatever the left. You might be familiar with Baltimore and called the black butterfly, the white owl. Anyway, what we found was that there was very few rain gauges where there were people of color compared to Portland. It's different. The city has a different structure and density somewhat, but it's still a lot of the same densities. And but it's a white city, and there's rain gauges everywhere. And so these is a picture of the rain gauge. Basically what it boils down to is that there's just, especially in urban and suburban areas, there's a much more likely to be rain gauges in areas that are predominantly white. And so there's very little ability there's not enough data really for fine scale forecasting around flooding in communities of color. So these spatial gaps have a lot of consequences. This is another example. This is just from Brussels. Fix My Street. You guys know that little app? An urban planning citizen science project. It's just reporting potholes and stuff. It's like See, Click, Fix. We have that in Raleigh. Report, oh, my sidewalk's cracked, whatever. Anyway, this is comparing the distribution of what they call disadvantaged ethnicities, which is largely immigrant communities in Brussels, at their location to the location of people using the app. And they don't correspond. And something they have been working on and puzzling over as to how to get broader engagement. Just one more example. So here's Riverwatch. This is volunteer water monitoring in the state of Illinois. And what's shown here is the demographics. So you can see racial demographics and educational demographics for the state of Illinois, and then compared to the Riverwatch participants, which basically shows they're disproportionately, that white participants are overrepresented and really highly educated participants are overrepresented. And because of segregation in where people live and where they monitor the rivers, what that means is that the streams that have data and that get designated as impaired and then get funding to be remediated are those segments that are in white and wealthy areas. This is just their graph, comparing it with the EPA's EJ screen, and they have very few sites that are actually in EJ. All right, so I'm just going to give an example just of one of my projects called Crowd the Tap. It's about household drinking water safety, like particularly related to lead. And did I do that little squiggle? Anyway, this is a paper that's in review right now from a postdoc in my lab. Did I do that squiggle? I don't know what that little green squiggle is. Okay. Anyway, so just in case you're not familiar, the source of contamination for lead in water is actually from the pipes that transport water. It's not from the water bodies or whatever. It's from the pipes themselves. I can say there's no hobby groups that actually are interested in pipes. So anyway, not something anybody really knows or cares about. It's buried underground. Anyway, and so what this image is showing is that the red portion of the pipes infrastructure is managed, that's the public portion, and it's managed and is the responsibility of utility companies. Once it crosses onto private property, all the blue pipes, that's the responsibility of whoever owns that property. And so the way the law is written here in the United States is that minimizing lead in water is a shared responsibility between the utilities and the household. And for the utilities, what they are supposed to do is just, they pick a subset of homes that they sample every year. If a certain percentage of those homes have lead that exceeds a certain level, then it's actionable. And the action they take is to notify the customers and to treat the water so it doesn't cause any more corrosion. And that's really it. And then there's no support for households. Anyway, so Crowd the Tap tries to at least help people screen their homes. What we do is we can't test all the homes. So we've set up Crowd the Tap to be a screening tool and a citizen science project. So the way the screening works is people provide information about the types of pipes they have. And it doesn't have to be just lead pipes, because copper pipes are often soldered with lead and steel pipes are sometimes lined with lead. Anyway, about the age of the home and some really simple water chemistry information that they can provide. And then we are able to we have a Bayesian belief network model, and it helps us classify households, whether they're low risk or high risk. They don't have to, maybe if they didn't provide enough information, we encourage them to provide more. If they're high risk, so we use the screening basically to prioritize how we're going to allocate our testing, the resources that we have for testing. And then we test mostly in the lab, and then, see if people have leaded water or not, provide resources. And ultimately, we hope everyone ends up safe from lead and water. Anyway, that's the gist of the project. We also, during this, I said it's also a citizen science project. We ask about demographics, because one of our research questions is to see if there's any racial or economic disparities in risk of lead and water. And we ask address, it's geospatial. Anyway, okay, so we're comparing like the participants that come to the project with, I'm going to call this unfacilitated. Like they heard us on Science Friday, or whatever, they came through SciStarter or whatnot. Anyway, we have the same racial problems, like same lack of diversity. So what you can see here is compared, this is just lumping white and not white basically. And then there's some that it's adjusted because there was some that prefer not to say. But anyway, so compared to the national averages, our participants in this unfacilitated group are overrepresented white households. And what we did here was we worked with facilitator organizations to try to address this. And so the unfacilitated, it was like about 500 households. Anyway, I worked with corporate volunteer groups. Well, one in particular, Verizon corporate volunteers. Been starting to work with faith communities, with teachers in high school, and with universities. And we support our facilitator groups, like we have lesson plans for teachers, AP Environmental Science, AP Chemistry. We have stipends for them. We have equipment. We have testing stuff. Same with the North Carolina Council of Churches is our partner with faith communities, doing webinars, providing kits, and then same with the corporate volunteer program. And then we have with our universities, with Shaw and with NC State, we have interns who function as ambassadors, recruiting households to the project, often through their own social networks. These are Deja's students here. Back before she started grad school, she ran this project. Anyway, what we have found is that with the help of facilitators, our projects are more representative and in line with national demographics. And the way this sort of breaks out a little bit here is that for Black households are now sampled or represented like on par with national average among the facilitated groups. Same with Asian, and then also our Hispanic households are still underrepresented, but much more represented than compared to unfacilitated. And we have a high proportion of mixed race households in both categories. Anyway, so, and this is just breaking it up by race. The main takeaway here is that for our Black households, the university recruitment was really important. And for our Hispanic households, the high school engagement was really important. And so, yeah, we increased diversity, but we didn't measure inclusiveness. We didn't measure equitability. We didn't measure accessibility. And actually representation really isn't enough. Like for some citizen science projects, like you could imagine if you engage a bunch of people, you could sort of estimate inclusiveness based on retention, like who stays, who does more. We can't do that with Crowd Tap because it's one and done. It's like each household participates once and that's it. We don't really know, and we didn't do a survey or measure how inclusive it seemed to be. And in terms of equity, like I said, we're now have representation that's like on par with national demographics. But frankly, we know from other studies that households of color are more likely to have aged infrastructure and other water quality problems. So really to be equitable, we should probably have participation be overrepresenting households of color. And like I said, we didn't address accessibility at all. Anyway, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because achieving diversity without inclusion and equity, it might satisfy some of those data requirements when we're talking about like the spatial problems with, the problems with the geospatial data from citizen science, but it's missing a lot. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples of why it matters. And this is from regular science, not participatory science. You're probably familiar with these. Did you know that it used to be that women were 17% more likely to be killed in car wrecks than men, and 73% more likely to be injured in car wrecks? You're like, women are such bad drivers. No, because even if they weren't driving, if they were just in the passenger seat, this is more likely, right? And are people familiar with this? Some are, yeah. Those because of crash test dummies, right? Because men were making these, and what used to be the test dummies were all men. They were shaped like men. And then people pointed this out. So dang. I just totally picture, and I'd hope it's so done, but this dweeby engineers were like, we can make women ones. They just shrunk them. They just made little tiny men. And they were like, these are women. And it was like, no, have they not ever touched a woman? Like, I don't know, I'm just kidding. But anyway, so those didn't work. Anyway, and then it was like, okay, go back to the drawing board. And now they make them, yeah, like that the women are not just tiny little men. So anyway, it's helped improve matters. But the point being that, men didn't realize it just from whatever, we'll get into that. Another example of this regular science, but also related to gender, is in my field of ornithology, which kind of with my generation, maybe a little after, like a big influx of women in ornithology. And with that came different kinds of discoveries that really weren't happening when the field, for a century had been dominated by men. And one of those was related to the fact, was way more about female birdsong, right? All the studies about birdsong had been about male birds singing. And it wasn't until there was a bunch of women in ornithology where there started to be studies by women of song by female birds. And this is about evolution and, ancestral presence of it. It's super common. And there's a lot of evolutionary and ecological insights that have come about because of women in ornithology. Anyway, I'm just trying to give a sense as to why it's important, not just for the data point, but to have a lot of different perspectives in science. And so, so when I want to switch, so it's not quite sufficient to say like that participatory science has a diversity problem for a lot of reasons, because in a lot of ways, then people are like, oh, okay, well, then we just need to bring in people and not thinking about inclusion, but just like not change anything, but just like bring in people and have a lot of people just assimilate to this structure that we have. And that's really not the answer. It's not really what's going to provide the benefits of having a lot of different people. So anyway, when we look at this pattern that I talked about, the other thing we have to remember about segregation is that that's what enables environmental injustices, right? The fact that we're spatially segregated. That's why people in New York can ship all their literal waste, sewage waste, down to Mississippi, right? That's like on trains. Have you heard of the poop trains? Right? Okay, like literal waste. Like, anyway, so much of the reason there's so many environmental injustices on communities of color is because they're separated. Anyway, so there's different lived experiences, and even beyond, EJ issues. There's also its effects, different epistemologies, different ways of knowing, different ways we approach knowledge production. And we see this in the participatory sciences. And, okay, so just some quick examples, like I mentioned monarch butterflies, this big discovery of monarchs migrating, of loggerhead sea turtles. These, and the typical participants there, white, highly educated, whatnot, wealthy. It's the hobby, it's fun, whatever. Other kinds of projects, like in North Carolina, there was a lot of community-based participatory research on hog farms that led to the moratorium on the spray fields. And a lot of work in California that was done related to air quality from these different sources that led to a bill to help regulate those. And those were done by some environmental justice leaders in those communities. And so what we see across the participatory sciences, and most of what I have been describing has been these institution-driven, very top-down kinds of projects. That's just part of the participatory sciences. It is the part that engages mostly white and affluent people. It is the part that aligns with mainstream science agendas. It has a volunteer kind of perspective. The people who engage are volunteering for science. It's a very privileged position to be in. And it reflects dominant culture priorities. In the community-driven part of participatory science is really very different. It's very multicultural. It's grassroots, engages many more people of color, and many people who are marginalized in different ways. And it's actually considered undone science, right? So we have our dominant culture, like research priorities, like male song and birds, whatever, or whatever it might be. And there's a lot of research that's considered undone science. No one's addressing it. None of the big institutions are addressing it. And so people in a grassroots sense rise up and say, well, we need these addressed, so we'll do it ourselves. Anyway, so that's kind of this community driven. And these have different names. So a lot of what I described as citizen science are these top-down institution driven. There's a lot of modes of it. You know, there's participatory sensing, or there's mapping, and there's volunteer monitoring, a lot of names. And then there's the sort of this community science side. And again, a lot of different approaches: community owned and managed research, community-based participatory research, participatory action research, a lot of different approaches. What the knowledge gained from them is really very different. The scale is often really very different as well. Anyway, and this is why, well, I guess a couple of years ago now, we had a paper in Science that I led on this naming issue, because there's this trend in that was happening, and it's kind of not anymore. So I feel like this was effective. But anyway, of people saying, well, let's just not call it citizen science, you know, because, and to people's credit, saying like, oh, there's a problem with, you know, people are oppressed and excluded and whatnot by citizenship status. So maybe we should rethink that name. But people were just wanting to call it community science. So we wrote this piece to say, you know what? Community science is something different. And you don't want to just rebrand and co-opt that term. And plus it would leave all the real diversity, equity, and inclusion work undone. People want like a simple solution, like just change the name. Anyway, some people read this and they were like, Caren, I can't believe you're defending the term citizen science. I'm like, did you read the paper? We were defending the practice of community science from being called citizen science. Anyway, to just bring this along. So what's happening here is that there's not underrepresentation in the participatory sciences. It's really also very segregated. And it mirrors the segregation in the environmental movement, right? And this is Van Jones was saying, we essentially have a racially segregated environmental movement, but we're too polite to say that. Instead, we say that we have an environmental justice movement and a mainstream movement. And we see this with, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with Green 2.0, Dorcetta Taylor's, the project that came out of this, that work that Dorcetta Taylor did on diversity in the environmental organizations. This is basically like the big NGOs, the environmental organizations led, you know, with white leaders, and the environmental justice organizations predominantly, you know, led by people of color. All environmental movements. But so anyway, so I don't think it's fair to say that there's a lack of interest, a lack of, you know, people involved in participatory science who are people of color. There's different priorities. There's different practices, different approaches that just make it be really different. But my focus has been on really large scale participatory science. And so that's why we've started what's called the IDEAL. So it's inclusive, diverse, equitable, accessible, large scale participatory science. These things that are citizen science in many respects. There's so much power to those kind of large scale crowdsourcing kind of efforts. But how can they change like structurally, like in so many different ways so that these large scale projects are inclusive and equitable and accessible. Anyway, and that's the challenge of our working group, this initiative that we have. There's a group of us that NSF funded for a series of meetings. It was mostly people of color and with other marginalized identities who have expertise in participatory science. And we've created the IDEAL handbook. It's being pilot tested. We're just starting to pilot test it now with a few different sort of friendly projects. Actually, ones that we had published about, like Audubon's Christmas bird count. They're one of our pilot testers. Published about Cocoa Ross. They're one of our pilot testers. So anyway, so it was good calling people in, and people are really eager to work on this. We're also working with a NASA project. And I'll just say briefly, like this is sort of the gist of it. It involves two phases. And the first phase is very internal about positionality. And then the second phase is like practice, like things that you enact. And we have a whole bunch of things people might do. I'm just a little curious if people have heard of positionality before or what's meant by that. No. Was there one hand? No. I would think the social, right, anyone who does social science research at all should probably be familiar with positionality, because social science researchers acknowledge that science is not objective. Maybe I'll have a show of hands on that. How many people think science is objective? Anyone? Is anyone, did I ask it in a way that no one's gonna tell me? Okay, well, so I'm gonna say it's not objective. And I would hope that those examples with the gender biases would show it's not objective. We all bring our social identities, our lived experiences. We all bring who we are to how we approach knowledge. And positionality are these exercises to explore that and help see it. And it's actually easiest for people with marginalized identities to see what they bring to the table and what perspectives they bring. It's actually hardest for people in dominant culture to see it. Because it's like, I mean, it's like if dominant culture were like this green, whatever, this lime paint, like that would, like if you're dominant culture, you're just adding more lime paint. There's no contrast. It's supporting the status quo. It's like, it's reinforcing what's present. Anyway, so there's a lot in seeing, being able to see that. It's really hard when there's no contrast. So anyway, we're hoping these sort of positionality exercises with a lot of reflection, reflexivity, whatever, will be helpful in priming people to be able to see how their project can change and could change to be inclusive. Anyway, I'm happy to have questions about it. But anyway, so my hope is that I do think that the geospatial kind of oriented participatory science is awesome, but it could be much better, especially if we make it ideal. And with that, I'll take questions. Thank you. I usually try to go right to the hour, but I ended a few minutes early.
Wow, thanks, Caren. Sure. I'm feeling inspired. Like anyone else ready to change careers and follow Caren? Yes, we have time for about 6 or 7 minutes of questions. I'll run the mic to you. Chris?
So for the engagement groups that you mentioned in your presentation, was there like challenges associated with like getting engagement up, and like was it like sort of like, did people initially say like what is this, or like what did people like rejected like initially?
Do you mean with Crowd the Tap?
Yeah.
And with like the facilitators?
Yeah. So yeah.
Like, so did the facilitators say what is this, or do you mean when they engaged?
When they engaged the people.
Yeah. Like it really varies. Like, so part of it I feel like is unfair. It's like, okay, teachers, like they literally are signing their students. Like you need parental consent, take this home, like it's kind of like, okay, your household needs to participate. So there's not even like a lot of choice in that regard, other than the teacher choosing. In terms of with our churches, which we still have kind of low participation. I hope this is answering your question. That situation was such that like, there's a lot of churchgoers are older. Young people don't go to church. So like, there's a big digital divide. And so, and also like figuring out kind of pipes you have, like sometimes you got to go in a crawl space, sometimes like it's not always easy. So it actually required a really good faith community ambassador who can help people. Like there was a lot of like one-on-one kind of help. With our ambassadors, like from universities, really varied also, like in terms of what worked best was when they relied on their own social networks, and those who had really large social networks in their hometowns. Like we ran it this year again with a new cohort, and we did it as like a service learning spring break. So they did all the prep work before spring break, and then they went home, and after all the households had screened, they went home at spring break and literally just went around everybody's house to collect the water instead of having people do that. But anyway, so it just kind of varied. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I had a question also about your Crowd the Tap project, and you mentioned that you didn't really address the accessibility issues with that. Is that something like if this project is ongoing that you're planning on including in the future, and like how would you go about doing that?
Yeah. So the funding is running out in August. So, and I don't know that we're going to continue it. We're going to, I mean, it's going to continue in some ways, maybe with, with a particular partnership. But yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm just learning about, when I say accessibility, like we have on our team, we've been consulting with like someone who specializes in like physical disabilities and ADA compliance. Because there's multiple meanings to like what makes something accessible. Like, we did have one undergraduate that was starting to help us I don't know if this would be considered accessibility in some ways, like to translate the site into Spanish, because we, we're having a low representation from Hispanic households. We thought maybe that'll help. But yeah, in terms of like, yeah, there's just a lot of expertise that we need, like in terms of making websites ADA compliant, like for screen readers. Like it's hard for like a data entry site to accommodate a screen reader, is my impression so far. But is that what you're asking? Like that kind of ADA kind of accessibility?
Yeah, or just in terms of whatever you meant by accessible when you said that you weren't addressing accessibility.
Yeah. I'm still learning. I mean, is the bottom line.
Yeah. Thanks.
One more question.
Thanks so much. So my question is, when you're presenting these data that show the racial segregation of the citizen science or participatory science data that you're collecting, like in the Baltimore rainfall example, the areas that were highest Black population and had the least number of rainfall monitors looked like they were in the areas closest to water, and therefore I would expect most prone to flooding. And then with like your Crowd the Tap example, you were talking about how minoritized groups are more likely to have lead in their waters. And so you need to oversample those populations to be actually equitable. How do you accomplish that without overburdening these under-resourced communities for these institutionally driven science projects, basically, and continually asking them to contribute and contribute and contribute, even though hopefully the outcomes are going to be beneficial for them?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that is like the line to walk or whatever of like, I mean, it's overburdening if it's extractive, right? And if it's more for like the benefit of my project or me or my publications than it is for like people who might need that, because yes, it would bring more flood protection, or it would bring more, safer drinking water. So I think it's in the balance of the outcomes, like in the ability to achieve those outcomes when it comes to, when it comes to that. And that's why, like, yeah, at one level, it's like, well, of course, iNaturalist or eBird, why would people who are like below poverty level be like out there like birding, like if they're trying to meet basic needs? So in that regard, yeah, like if I have a project that requires volunteering for me or for science or for something that's not directly relevant, of course I'm going to expect and only want like the most privileged people to be doing that. Like, why would I burden somebody? Yeah. And so I think it's a matter of having those science priorities like authentically be the priorities of a broader segments of the population and lead to outcomes for a broader segment of the population.
Thank you, Caren. Let's all give Caren a big thank you. And you around taking?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, if Caren has a few minutes, if anybody wants to have one-on-one with her right now.